There is a room in Oxford, England, at the Ashmolean Museum, where a small clay prism sits inside a glass case. It is not large. You could hold it in one hand. It stands roughly 20 centimetres tall, four-sided, fired from the same river clay that every building in ancient Mesopotamia was made from, and it is inscribed on every face with columns of wedge-shaped marks pressed into the surface by a reed stylus. The marks are tight and precise. Whoever made this object took time. They were not scratching notes in a hurry. They were recording something they believed would matter long after the clay had dried and the reed had been set down. The prism's catalogue number at the Ashmolean is AN 1923.444. It was purchased around 1921 or 1922 from the site of Kish, in what is now Iraq, by a collector named Herbert Weld Blundell, which is why it is sometimes called the Weld Blundell prism. Scholars date the object itself to approximately 1800 BC, placing it in the period when the city of Larsa dominated the southern Mesopotamian plain, but the text inscribed on it is almost certainly a copy of an older document, perhaps several older documents. The scribes of Larsa were working from something that had already been worked on before them, revised and recopied across generations of tablet rooms in cities whose names most people alive today have never heard spoken aloud. What it contains is a list of kings. It begins before human memory. It begins, in the words of the text itself, with a statement that has no equivalent in any document from the ancient world. The translation from the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, Oxford, goes like this: after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridug. That single sentence is worth sitting with for a moment, not reading past it, sitting with it. After the kingship descended from heaven, not after the first king was born, not after a strong man seized power from a weaker one, not after a tribe crossed a river and conquered a city, after the kingship descended from heaven. The text is making a claim about what kingship is. It is saying that kingship is a thing, a substance, something with weight and form and location, something that exists prior to any individual king, something that came from outside the human world and entered it at a specific point, at a specific place, and then moved. The place it entered first was Eridug, which we call Eridu, the oldest city in the Sumerian list, possibly the oldest city in the world, or at least among those with an archaeologically attested claim to that title. A city at the edge of the southern marshes where the land and the water blur together, where fresh river water meets the salt water of the Persian Gulf in a tangle of reeds and silt and the smell of something very old. In Eridu, according to the list, a man named Alulim became the first king. He ruled for 28,800 years. The second king was named Alalyar. He ruled for 36,000 years. The two of them together ruled Eridu for 64,800 years. Then the text records one of the most important phrases in the entire document. It says, "Then Eridu fell, and the kingship was taken to Bad Tibera." Taken, not inherited, not conquered, not voted upon or transferred by blood. Taken, the Sumerian verb is badeh. It means carried. The kingship was carried somewhere else. That is the machine. That is the whole of it. A substance called Namlugal, kingship, that descends from a divine source, occupies a city, occupies a king, and when the moment comes, is carried to a new location, a new city, a new ruler. The individual kings are vessels, the kingship is the content, and the content outlasts every vessel it has ever occupied. You need to understand this before anything else. because every king who comes after this moment in the list is operating inside this framework. Every claim to power, every divine ancestry, every god king who declared himself the son of a moon deity or the beloved of a war goddess, every political revolution that installed a new dynasty in a new city, all of it is shaped at the structural level by this opening statement and this verb. The kingship was carried. It will be carried again. Before the flood, according to the list, 5 cities held the kingship and 8 kings ruled in sequence. Eridu, Bad Tabira, Lurag, Zimbir, Kurapag. The reigns are measured in units called sars, each sar representing 3,600 years. The number 3,600 is not arbitrary. It is a sexagesimal unit, the foundational counting structure of Sumerian mathematics, and it connects the measurement of kingship directly to astronomical time. The celestial year, the movement of planets across the sky in their slow, vast, regular cycles. This means the pre-flood kings are not measured in human generations. They are measured in the same units used to count the orbits of stars. Their reigns are calibrated against the cosmos itself, not against the span of a human life. Whatever you believe about whether these figures are literal or symbolic, or astronomical or mythological, they are functioning as something specific. They are anchoring the institution of kingship to a timescale that no human dynasty can challenge or disprove. If your reign is measured in units of 3,600 years, no one alive can reach back far enough to test your claim. The 8th king before the flood, a man named Ubartutu, ruled Kurapag for 18,600 years. Then the flood swept over the land, and after the flood the kingship descended from heaven again. The Sumerian king list is not primarily interested in what the flood was or why it happened. It moves past the flood with clinical efficiency, a single line. The flood swept over. Then the kingship descended again. And the list continues, now with kings whose reigns are shorter, measured not in sars but in years and months, beginning to approach, gradually, and then suddenly, the territory of recorded history. This shift in timescale is deliberate. The pre-flood kings serve a purpose. They establish the divine origin and infinite antiquity of the institution. The post-flood kings serve a different purpose. They connect that divine institution to actual, verifiable political authority. The mechanism bridges myth and administration. It says, in effect, the same kingship that existed before human time is the same kingship that now sits in your city, in your temple, being carried by your current king. Close your eyes for a moment if you like. Let the room you are in become very dark and very quiet. Imagine you are in the tablet room of a Sumerian city in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Surrounded by the smell of fresh clay and lamp oil, listening to a scribe read this text aloud to a prince who will someday need to justify his rule to priests, to enemies, to the people who look up at the palace wall and wonder who gave that man the right to command them. The answer is already written. The kingship descended from heaven. It has always been so. It will always be so. And it is here, now, in this city, in this king. Sleep carries you the way the list carries kingship, from one place to the next. From one moment into another, you will not remember. The boundary between the two dissolves at some point you cannot identify afterward. The list carries you further. There is something quietly strange about the kings who appear in the list before the flood, and scholars have noted it for decades, but it is the kind of observation that sounds mundane in academic writing and becomes something else entirely when you sit with it in the dark. The pre-flood kings have no fathers. In every royal inscription from ancient Mesopotamia, the first thing a king establishes is his genealogy. My father was so-and-so. My father's father was so-and-so. The chain of descent matters enormously because it locates the king within a known human lineage, connects him to previous holders of power, gives him credibility that is rooted in blood and recognizable to anyone who knows the history of the city. To be king in Sumer is to be a son in a very specific sense. The chain of fathers is the chain of authority. The pre-flood kings have no chains. They appear on the list without parentage, without origin, without any human connection at all. Alulim was king, Alauyar was king, and Menluana was king. They ruled for thousands of years, and then they stopped ruling, and someone else ruled, and then the flood came. There is no mention of how they came to power, who came before them in human terms, who their mothers were, who taught them to govern. They are simply there, the way stars are simply there, already present when you look up. This is not an oversight. Sumerian scribes were meticulous. The absence of fathers for the pre-flood kings is as deliberate as the choice of the verb barde for the transfer of kingship. It creates a category of ruler who exists outside the normal mechanisms of human succession. Their authority does not derive from lineage. It derives directly from the divine kingship substance that descended from heaven and occupied them. After the flood, everything changes. The first post-flood king appears in the city of Kitch, and from this point onward, the kings in the list begin acquiring fathers, connections, genealogies, stories. The shift happens gradually and not all at once. But the direction is clear. The further you move from the flood, the more the kings begin to look like people embedded in the ordinary fabric of human history. And then you reach a name that the archaeologist Trow has confirmed in the ground. His name is Enmebaragesi. He appears in the list as a king of Kitch, the first post-flood city to hold the kingship. The list gives him a reign of 900 years, which is still far beyond what any human life can contain, but the name itself is not just literary. Archaeologists working at Kish in the early 20th century found inscribed alabaster vase fragments that carry this name. The fragments date to approximately 2600 BCE. The vases are physical, touchable objects that were made by human hands within a few generations of a king who actually held power in that place. Enmebaragesi is the earliest named individual in Mesopotamian history whose existence has been confirmed by archaeology, and he is inside the list. This is where the document's architecture becomes genuinely dazzling, if you are willing to look at it steadily. The Sumerian king list takes a real political landscape, with real kings and real cities and real transitions of power, and frames it inside a cosmological structure that connects all of that history to a divine origin that is, by definition, unverifiable. You cannot dig up the pre-flood kingship. You cannot find an inscription that predates the flood and check the reign lengths against the stars. But you can find Enmebaragesi's vase. And because Enmebaragesi's vase is in the list, and the list connects him to Alulim, who received the kingship from heaven, the political authority of every real king who follows is tethered, by virtue of that chain, to the cosmos. The power of that architecture is not in any single claim. It lies in the gap between the two ends of the chain. Real evidence at one end, unprovable cosmology at the other, and a chain long enough that no one stands at both ends at once. After Enmebaragesi, the list mentions a king called Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, the name that will eventually become the greatest story of the ancient world. A man, or a myth, or something between the two, who travelled to the ends of the earth looking for the secret of immortality and came back empty-handed, carrying instead the knowledge that the only immortality available to human beings is the kind that lives in a story told after you are gone. In the Sumerian king list, Gilgamesh is recorded as the 5th king of the first dynasty of Uruk. His reign is listed as 126 years. His son Ur-Nungal is listed after him with a reign of 30 years. His father's name in the original Sumerian text is given as Elilu. The word Lilu is one of the most discussed terms in Sumerian scholarship. It is sometimes translated as a shade, a ghost, a demon of a particular class, a phantom, an unknown mortal, or simply as nothing, in the sense that the scribe recording the list did not know who the father was and marked it with a term that indicated uncertain or supernatural origin. Functionally, it means this: Gilgamesh's father was something that could not be named as a human being. His mother is given elsewhere as Ninsun, a goddess. His father is a phantom. This differs from the pre-flood kings having no fathers at all. Those kings had no fathers because they were the original vessel of the divine kingship, the first containers into which the Nam-Lugal poured itself. Gilgamesh has a father. The father is just not a person. The father is a category that marks the boundary between the divine and the human, a space where the two worlds touched and produced a king who was, according to the later epic, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. The Lilu mechanism solves a specific political problem. In a world where genealogy is everything, where every claim to authority depends on a chain of fathers reaching back through time, a new dynasty cannot simply announce itself. It needs a plausible connection to the divine institution that has been travelling from city to city since before the flood. If your father was a known human being, that father can be challenged, his lineage investigated, his claim questioned. If your father is a Lilu, a phantom, a shade from the boundary between worlds, no one can investigate that. No one can produce evidence against it. The claim is exactly as unfalsifiable as the pre-flood reigns measured in units of 3,600 years. The phantom father is a tool. It transforms a man of uncertain or inconvenient origin into the vessel of something that came from outside the human world, something no genealogist can reach. Gilgamesh's 126-year reign was followed by his son Ur-Nungal's 30 years, and then the list moves on through more kings, more cities, more transfers of the Nam-Lugal from one location to the next. But Gilgamesh remains in the list the way a particular kind of stain remains in old clay, present, indelible, marking the place where the divine and the human pressed against each other and left an impression. The story that grew around that impression, the tablets that would eventually be found in the ruins of Nineveh 2.5 millennia later, those tablets were not yet written. The Gilgamesh that exists in the Sumerian king list is not yet the wanderer, the grief-stricken friend, the man who held the dead body of someone he loved and understood for the first time that he too would die. He is just a number, 126 years, a reign, a vessel through which the Nam-Lugal passed on its way from one city to another. That is all any of them are in the list. Numbers, reigns, vessels, but the list remembers every one of them. The first city to hold the kingship after the flood was Kitch. The second was Uruk. The third was Ur. The kingship moved between them, carried in that verb bade, the same verb each time, marking each transfer with the same grammatical structure that had been used for the pre-flood transitions. The formula repeats. It is designed to repeat. The repetition is the argument. The same thing happened here. The same thing happened here. The same thing has always happened. Through the dynasties of Ur and Uruk and Kitch, the list accumulates kings. Some of them are footnotes with names no one outside scholarship has heard. Some of them cast long shadows across the next 3,000 years of history. One of them cast a shadow so long that it may have reached across the ocean into stories that were written down millennia after his empire turned to dust. His name was Sargon, and before he was a king, he was a servant who poured water into the cup of a man who wanted him dead. The story of Sargon of Akkad exists in two versions in the ancient record. The Sumerian king list version is terse, as the list always is. Sargon is listed as the king who seized power from Lugal-Zaggisi of Uruk, the man who had briefly unified the southern Mesopotamian plain under his own rule before Sargon ended it. What the list gives Sargon is a father described as a gardener, which is about as far from divine origin as the Sumerian record allows. No phantom here. No Lilu, no goddess mother, a gardener. But there is a second document, a poem about Sargon's birth that circulated in cuneiform libraries for over 1,000 years, in which Sargon himself speaks. In this text he describes his mother as a high priestess who placed him in a basket of rushes sealed with bitumen and set him in the river, and a man named Atki, a drawer of water, a gardener, pulled him from the river and raised him. The goddess Istar, he says, loved him, and so he became king. A basket in a river, a child whose mother was a holy woman and whose father was unknown, an adoptive father who worked the earth, a deity who chose him. This story belongs to a pattern that appears across the ancient world, a pattern scholars call the birth legend of the exposed hero, the child of divine or exceptional parentage, separated from that parentage at birth, raised in obscurity, recognized by fate, and elevated to greatness. The pattern appears in Mesopotamia in the Sargon legend. It appears in Greece in the story of Perseus. It appears in the Hebrew Bible in the story of Moses. The parallels between the Sargon legend and the Moses birth narrative are precise enough that scholars have been debating their relationship for generations. But what matters for the list, for the machine the list describes, is this. The Sargon who appears in the Sumerian king list received the kingship despite having no traditional claim to it, no divine ancestry, no royal father, no phantom lineage. He was a cupbearer to the king of Kish, a man named Uzababa, a servant, a man who poured wine for someone else. There is a Sumerian poem about this moment, about Sargon and Uzababa, in which the king has a dream and sees in that dream that the goddess Inanna is drowning him in a river of blood, and he sends Sargon on a mission intended to get him killed. And Sargon survives, and Inanna's favour follows him from that point forward. The poem is damaged, large sections are missing, but what survives is enough to show the outline of the transfer. A king loses divine favour, a servant receives it. The mechanism transfers the Nam Lugal from the vessel that has lost the capacity to hold it to the one who can. The mechanism does not care about birth. It does not care about blood. It cares about whether the gods are with you, and the gods can be with anyone. This is the most radical implication of the Sumerian king list, and it is almost always overlooked in popular discussions that focus on the impossible reign lengths or the pre-flood kings. The document does not argue for hereditary monarchy in the biological sense. It argues for something more dangerous and more durable, the idea that divine selection can bypass bloodlines entirely. The kingship is a substance carried by the divine will, and the divine will is not constrained by who your father was, which means that anyone could receive it, which means that no one is automatically excluded, which means that every person who ever wanted power had, inside the structure of this document, a possible justification. Sargon founded the Akkadian Empire. At its height, it stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast, from the mountains of what is now Iran to the plains of what is now Syria. It was the first empire in recorded history, and its founder was, according to the oldest records, a man whose adoptive father drew water from a garden. The empire lasted about 180 years. Sargon's grandson was a man named Naram-Sin, and Naram-Sin is where the mechanism of divine kingship encountered its first great crisis, because Naram-Sin was not content to be the vessel of the Nam-Lugal. He wanted to be its source. He added the divine determinative to his name, a sign in cuneiform that indicated a god was being named, and began signing official documents as a deity, not as a king beloved of the gods, not as a king chosen by the gods, as a god. He built temples to himself. He accepted worship from his subjects. He was, as far as the historical record can determine, the first Mesopotamian ruler to declare himself divine while still living and ruling. The Cursing of Ogadi is a long poem preserved in multiple tablets, whose composition has been dated to somewhere between the late Ur III period and the early Old Babylonian period, roughly 2100 to 1800 BCE. It purports to explain why the city of Ogadi, Sargon's capital, was destroyed, and why the curse placed on it by the god Enlil was so total that the city was never rebuilt, and its ruins have never been definitively located. The poem begins in abundance. Under Sargon, the poem says, "Holy Inanna set up her throne in Agade and blessed it beyond all measure. The warehouses were full. The people ate splendid food and drank splendid beverages. Monkeys and mighty elephants, water buffalo and thoroughbred dogs jostled in the public squares. Ships moored at the harbour in joy. Even Mahachi, a distant land, was re-entered on the tribute rolls. The text describes Agade under Sargon as something close to paradise, a city so favoured by heaven that the gods themselves could barely process the volume of offerings." And then Inanna left. She left the way someone leaves when they decide they are no longer welcome. Quietly, without explanation, she abandoned the sanctuary of Agade like someone abandoning the young women of her woman's domain. She took the gift of battle from the city and handed it to the enemy. The gods stripped Agade of its attributes one by one. Ninurta took back the royal crown. Utu took away the city's eloquence. Enki took away its wisdom and pulled its fearsomeness up into the middle of heaven. The mooring pole that anchored Agade's divine charter was torn out of the Abzu by Enki himself. The weapons were taken by Inanna. And then the poem describes Naram-Sin. He saw in a nocturnal vision that Enlil would not let the kingdom of Agade occupy a pleasant, lasting residence. The text is precise about this. He saw it in a dream. He understood what the dream meant. And then he did not put the dream into words. He did not discuss it with anyone. 7 years. For 7 years, the poem says, Naram-Sin put on mourning clothes, covered his chariot with a reed mat, tore the canopy from his ceremonial barge. He persisted. The poem asks the question directly, asking it as though it cannot believe what it is describing. Who has ever seen a king burying his head in his hands for 7 years? No answer is given, because there is no answer, because no one had seen it before. He consulted the omens twice, asking each time whether he should rebuild the temple. Both times the omens said no. The answer from the gods was silence. And then Naram-Sin ignored the omens. He mobilized his troops. The poem describes him like a wrestler entering a great courtyard, like an athlete bent to begin a race. He climbed ladders against the walls of the Kur, the great temple of Enlil at Nippur. He had axes cast. He had double-edged blades sharpened. He attacked the temple the way you attack a mountain, trying to break it open like rock to get at the metal inside. He ripped out its drain pipes. He tore off its upper lintel. He struck the gate of well-being with a pickaxe. He stripped it of its cedar and cypress and juniper and boxwood. He filled boats with its gold and silver and copper and sailed them away down the river. The people could see the bedchamber of the gods. The holy treasure chest was open to anyone who cared to look. The poem identifies this as the central transgression, not the violence itself, but the exposure. The sacred becomes visible. The private room of divine power is made public. And once the inner room is seen, the mystery is broken. Enlil's response in the poem is to bring the Gutians down from the mountains. The Gutians are described in the text in terms that tell you exactly how the Sumerian scribes felt about them, an unbridled people, with human intelligence but canine instincts and monkey's features. This is not generous ethnography. This is terror dressed in contempt. The Gutians swept across the plain like small birds in great flocks, stretching their arms across the plain like a net for animals. Messengers stopped moving on the highways. Courier boats stopped moving on the rivers. The herds were driven off, and their herdsmen forced to follow. Prisoners manned the watchtowers. Brigands owned the roads. And then starvation. Oil for 1 shekel was only half a litre. Grain for 1 shekel was only half a litre. Dogs were packed together in the silent streets. If 2 men walked in those streets, the dogs devoured them, and if 3 men walked there, they were devoured too. Heads were sown like seeds. The poem ends with the gods cursing a god in terms so specific and so total that they function as an incantation of annihilation. May your holy walls resound with mourning to their highest point. May your juguna be reduced to a pile of dust. May your pilasters fall to the ground like tall young men drunk on wine. May your clay be returned to the Abzu, cursed by Enki. May your grain be returned to its furrow, cursed by Azinu. May your timber be returned to its forest, cursed by Ninilduma. May the cattle slaughterer slaughter his wife. May the sheep butcher butcher his child. May your gold be bought for the price of silver, your silver for the price of pyrite, your copper for the price of lead. And then may foxes that frequent ruin mounds brush with their tails your fattening pens. May the bird of depression make its nest in your gateways. May brackish water flow where fresh water once flowed for you. Before Utu on that very day, so it was. The poem does not argue against ambition or wealth or military expansion. What it argues in every one of those precise and terrible lines is that there is a difference between being the vessel of the Namlugal and declaring yourself its source. The kings before Naram-Sin held the kingship. Naram-Sin tried to own it, and the poem insists that you cannot own what descended from heaven. You can only hold it, for as long as the gods allow. The distinction is everything. In the darkness of your room, that distinction might feel abstract, an old theological argument dressed in poetry, but consider it from the perspective of every political system that has come after, every leader who has said, in whatever language and whatever century, that they do not serve the authority that place them in power, but that they are themselves the authority. Every institution that has stopped acknowledging anything higher than itself. The cursing of a godhead is not predicting what happens to those leaders. It is documenting the structure of the problem in terms so concrete that it landed in the ground and survived 4,000 years of destruction to be read here, now, in this room. After Naram Sin's death, the Akkadian Empire continued for a few more generations and then collapsed. The Gutians ruled for a period the Sumerian king list records with a notable line, one of the most unusual entries in the entire document, a parenthetical note that says, among the Gutian kings there was a period when there was no king, that they were nameless. That during this interval the dynasty produced 21 kings in 124 years and 40 days, and that the presiding spirit over this period was disorder. Who set these kings up? Who took them down? The list, for once, declines to say. The kingship was eventually rescued by Utu Hengel of Uruk, who drove the Gutians back to their mountains. And then almost immediately the Nam Lugal passed to Ur-Namma of Ur, the founder of the third dynasty of Ur, the Ur-3 period, which became the last great flowering of Sumerian civilization before it was absorbed into the broader Mesopotamian world and eventually, quietly, ceased to exist as a distinct culture. The third dynasty of Ur is when the machine became self-aware. Before arriving at Ur-Namma and his remarkable son, there is a figure in the Sumerian king list who deserves a slower moment, because she is singular and because she has been almost entirely forgotten, and what was done with her name afterward is one of the most extraordinary transformations in the entire history of ancient religion. Her name in the list is Kugbao. She is the only woman in the Sumerian king list, the only one. The text describes her as a Munus Lukurun Na, a female tavern keeper, an alewife, a woman who ran an establishment where people drank beer, which in ancient Mesopotamia was not a marginal enterprise. Beer was nutrition. Beer was currency. Beer was the medium through which grain was stored in liquid form and distributed through the city's economic network. The woman who ran a tavern was often a sophisticated economic operator, managing grain contracts and labour obligations and credit in ways that placed her at the intersection of commerce and social life. Picture her for a moment. A woman in Kish around 2400 BC, standing behind a clay counter worn smooth by the hands of the people who leaned against it. The light is low and amber. The smell of fermented grain hangs in the air the way it fills every room where people have gathered in every century since. Men from the docks argue about river levels. A scribe from the temple quarter nurses his cup and says nothing to anyone. She moves through all of it, quiet and precise, knowing the weight of every transaction, the name of every creditor, the exact point at which one measure of barley becomes political leverage. The list says Kugbao made firm the foundations of Kish, a phrase used elsewhere for genuine political achievement. It gives her a reign of 100 years. Her son Puzur-Sin ruled after her, and her dynasty, the third dynasty of Kish, lasted for several generations. She was a true monarch, a queen regnant, not a regent, not a placeholder, but a person who held the kingship in her own name. The Sumerian king list records this without ceremony or apology. She was a tavern keeper. She became king. The kingship descended to her the way it descended to everyone else, because the mechanism selected her. She is interesting enough in this form, a woman who ran a drinking establishment rising to rule one of the great cities of the ancient world. But what makes Ku Bao genuinely extraordinary is what happened to her name across the following 2,000 years. The goddess Kubaba is one of the major deities of the ancient Anatolian world, worshipped across what is now Turkey, associated with the city of Karkemish, depicted with a pomegranate and a mirror, wearing a tall headdress commanding a lion. Her cult was old when the Hittites were young. When the Phrygian and Lydian kingdoms rose in Anatolia after the Bronze Age collapse, they inherited her. She became Cybele in Phrygian religion, the great mountain mother, the wild goddess of untamed nature, whose rituals were ecstatic and whose priests made permanent physical sacrifices to demonstrate their devotion. From Phrygia, her cult travelled to Greece, and from Greece to Rome, where she was known as Magna Mater, the Great Mother, whose official introduction to Rome in 204 BCE is recorded in detail by ancient historians. Scholars working across Anatolian religion have argued at length about whether the Sumerian queen Kugbao and the goddess Kubaba are the same figure, or whether the name's similarity is coincidental. The argument is genuinely unresolved. What is not in dispute is that a woman with this name, or something very close to it, passed through 2,000 years of religious history and arrived in Rome as one of the most powerful goddesses in the ancient Mediterranean world, with state recognition, a temple on the Palatine Hill, and an annual festival. A tavern keeper, 100-year reign in Kish, a transformation across 2 millennia. The Nam-Lugal carried her differently than it carried Sargon or Gilgamesh. But the engine of transformation, the way a human figure embedded in the list becomes something larger and more durable than any individual life, that engine operated on her name across a span of time that makes every dynasty in the list look brief. Now return to Sargon for a moment, because there is something in his entry in the list that has not been fully considered yet. The list says his father was a gardener. A gardener is a human occupation. It is the most earthly possible origin, the man who tends soil, the man whose hands are in the ground, and yet the legend that grew around Sargon reaches past that gardener to something else. His mother was a high priestess. The river carried him. The goddess chose him. The gardener is the earthly surface of a story whose deeper architecture still connects Sargon's birth to the divine mechanism. The Sumerian king list and the biographical legends that clustered around individual kings were different documents making different arguments. The list records the political reality. Sargon had no royal blood, no divine genealogy, and still received the kingship. The legend records the mythological compensation. Here is why that was cosmically appropriate. The two documents support each other the way a skeleton and its skin support each other. The list provides the structural claim. The legend provides the narrative clothing. By the time the Year 3 period begins, both are operating at full sophistication. The list records the transfers. The royal hymns provide the narrative. The academies provide the infrastructure to keep both alive. Ur-Namar founded the third dynasty of Ur around 2112 BCE. He built the great ziggurat at Ur, whose stepped mud brick platform is still visible from the air in satellite photographs of modern Iraq. He wrote the oldest law code yet discovered, predating the Code of Hammurabi by 3 centuries. He established a bureaucratic state whose administrative records survive in the hundreds of thousands of clay tablets. He was, by most measures, one of the most consequential rulers of the ancient world. But it was his son who understood the full potential of the mechanism. His son's name was Shulgi. He ruled for 48 years, from approximately 2094 to 2046 BCE. And he spent those 48 years doing something no Mesopotamian king had done before, and very few have matched since. He systematically manufactured his own divinity in real time, using every literary, administrative, religious, and performative tool available to him, and he commissioned the documentation of that manufacture so that it would be preserved and transmitted to every future ruler who sat in a Sumerian throne room. The text that begins to describe this is called Shulgi A in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, catalogued as ECSL 2.4.2.01. It is a praise poem of Shulgi, composed in the first person, and its opening lines are the most confident opening lines in the ancient world. I, the king, was a hero already in the womb. I, Kulgi, was born to be a mighty man. I am a fierce-looking lion, begotten by a dragon. I am the king of the four regions. I am the herdsman and shepherd of the black-headed people. I am a respected one, the god of all the lands. 6 lines, 2 declarations of prenatal heroism, 1 declaration of leonine ferocity, 1 claim to universal kingship, 1 pastoral metaphor, 1 declaration of divinity. The poem continues, I am a child born of Ninsun. Ninsun is the divine mother also given to Gilgamesh, the goddess whose sons are heroes. In claiming her, Shulgi is not just claiming divine parentage, he is inserting himself explicitly into the lineage of the greatest hero the Sumerian world had known. He is saying, I am the continuation of that line. The phantom that fathered Gilgamesh and the goddess who bore him have now produced, through whatever mechanism operates in the divine world, a second great vessel. Me, he then describes himself as the choice of Holy Anne's heart, as the man whose fate was decided by Enlil, as the beloved of Ninlil, as he who is cherished by Nintud, as he who was endowed with wisdom by Enki, as the powerful king of Nana, as the growling lion of Utu, as Kulgi who has been chosen by Inanna for his attractiveness. 8 major deities, 8 separate divine endorsements. Every significant theological power in the Sumerian pantheon has specifically selected this one man, no one else. The poem then describes a performance that, if you encounter it for the first time in translation, reads like a physical impossibility, and then, as you sit with it, begins to sound like something else entirely. Shulgi describes running from Nippur to Ur and back, a round trip of roughly 200 miles in a single day, from the city of Enlil to the city of the moon god and back, covering 15 double hours of distance by the time the sun was setting, so that he could celebrate the religious festival of Essek in both cities on the same day. The poem describes what he encountered on the return journey. A storm shrieked, and the west wind whirled around. The north wind and the south wind howled at each other. Lightning together with the 7 winds competed in the heavens. Thundering storms made the earth quake. An echo roared in the broad heavens. The rains of heaven mingled with the waters of the earth. Small and large hailstones drummed on my back. I, the king, however, did not fear, nor was I terrified. He ran through it. He rushed forth like a fierce lion and galloped like an ass in the desert. With his heart full of joy, he ran onward. Trotting like a solitary wild ass, he covered 15 double hours, and he celebrated the festival in both Nippur and Ur on the same day. Then he went to the palace founded by An, and his singers praised him with songs accompanied by 7 Tiji drums and his spouse Inanna sat with him at the banquet. Truly I am not boasting, the poem says. That line reaches across 4,000 years like a smile you can almost see. Every line before it is boasting. The poem understands this completely, and it says it is not boasting with the confidence of a man who has understood that the difference between a boast and a divine claim is simply the altitude from which you speak. Shulgi is not boasting because he is not speaking as a man. He is speaking as a god, and gods do not boast, they describe themselves. The second Shulgi hymn, Shulgi B, ETCSL 2.4.2.02, is longer and more detailed about the administrative apparatus Shulgi was building to sustain his divine claims. It opens with emphatic genealogical assertion, I am a king, offspring begotten by a king and born by a queen. I, Kulgi the noble, have been blessed with a favourable destiny right from the womb. The hymn describes his education. He went to the Iduba, the scribal academy, as a child, and he mastered every skill: writing, music, mathematics, law, the management of land, the care of livestock, the art of war. He lists them with the specificity of someone who wants there to be no question this king is not merely receiving wisdom from the gods. He has acquired it through discipline, through study, through the ordinary hard work of learning, and the gods ratify what the work produced. Later in Shulgi B, the king makes a declaration that shifts the tone of the entire hymn. He says that he has built academies, tablet rooms, scribal schools in Nippur and Ur, and that the hymns composed to celebrate his name and his deeds are to be preserved in those academies. They are to be taught, they are to be copied, they are to be transmitted to future kings in perpetuity, and they are never to be altered. Never to be altered. That phrase is the moment the machine declares its own permanence. Not this king, not this dynasty, not this century, but the institution of scribal transmission itself, now enlisted in the project of preserving a specific set of claims about a specific king. Shulgi B was composed somewhere around 2050 BCE. Copies of it have been found in tablet deposits from the old Babylonian period, the period of Hammurabi roughly 300 years later. The academies worked, the copying continued, the hymns survived, and because the hymns survived, the political claims embedded in them survived too. Every scribe who copied Shulgi B was, in the act of copying, reproducing and endorsing the claim that Shulgi was born to a king and a queen, was blessed from the womb, was chosen by 8 major deities, and ran 200 miles through a storm without fear. Every school that taught this text was graduating students who had spent years with their hands on the clay, pressing those claims into material form day after day until the claims were as familiar as the alphabet. This is what Shulgi understood that Naram Sin did not. Naram Sin tried to make himself the source of the divine authority. Shulgi made himself the primary and permanent beneficiary of a system designed to perpetuate divine authority across time. He did not need to be the source. He needed to be in the machine. And more than that, he needed to be the king who commissioned the machine's next phase of development. He added the divine determinative to his name in the 21st year of his reign, following the precedent Naram Sin had set. But where Naram Sin assaulted a temple, Shulgi built institutions. He standardized weights and measures across the empire. He reformed the calendar. He established the messenger service. He built roads. He created an administrative system so efficient that its documentation still fills storage rooms in major museums around the world. And he commissioned hymns, more hymns than any king before him, hymns to himself as a runner, as a scholar, as a musician, as a warrior, as a judge, as a lover, as a deity. Hymns that placed him in the divine lineage of Gilgamesh and the cosmological framework of the Sumerian king list. Hymns designed to be preserved, copied, taught and transmitted. The hailstones drummed on his back, and he did not fear, and the hymns remember. The third dynasty of Ur lasted approximately a century. It fell not through military defeat alone, not through a single catastrophic battle, but through a slow collapse that the ancient texts document in a way that feels, across 4,000 years, uncomfortably familiar. The machine that Shulgi had built was sophisticated enough to run without him. What it could not survive was the simultaneous pressure of climate, economics, political fragmentation, and the quiet defection of the men who had been trusted to keep it operational. The last king of the third dynasty of Ur was named Ibbi-Sin. He ruled from approximately 2028 to 2004 BCE. His reign began in stability and dissolved into a series of crises whose outlines are preserved not in poetry but in letters. Real administrative letters pressed into clay, sent between real people managing a situation that was visibly deteriorating. One of those letters is preserved in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature as ETCSL 3.1.17. It is a letter from a man named Ishbi-Erra to his king Ibbi-Suen. Ishbi-Erra had been sent to the cities of Isin and Karzelu to purchase grain on behalf of the empire. The price of grain at this moment, according to the letter, had reached 1 shekel of silver per gur. Scholars have identified that rate as approximately 60 times the normal price. The markets of the empire were in catastrophic inflation. Ishbi-Erra wrote to his king, describing the situation in the language of a logistics officer who understands exactly how bad things have become. He had been given 20 talents of silver to purchase grain. With grain at 1 shekel per gur, he calculated that he could secure 72,000 gur of grain, enough to feed the city of Nippur and its surrounding territory for about 15 years. He had identified the grain, he had the silver, but he could not move the purchase because the rivers were controlled by the Martu, the Amorites, who had pressed in from the western steppe and were blocking the waterways. He needed 600 barges of 120 gur drult to transport the grain if he could secure it. He did not have the boats. He did not have the soldiers to clear the rivers. The exchange rate, the volume of grain, the number of barges, the 15-year supply calculation. This is not a poet composing a lament. This is a man with numbers in front of him and a crisis behind him, writing to a king who is presumably staring at the same numbers from the other end and finding no better answer. What the letter does not say, but what the historical record makes clear, is that Ishbi-Erra was not simply Ibbi-Sin's loyal servant trying to complete a difficult assignment. He was, in the language of the mechanism, positioning himself. While ostensibly managing the grain crisis on behalf of Ur, he was consolidating his own authority in the city of Isin, building relationships, accumulating resources, establishing a base of power that would eventually allow him to declare himself king of Isin in his own right. Separating that city from Ur's authority and inaugurating what scholars call the Isin Lhasa period, the era when the unity of the Sumerian world finally fractured into competing regional powers. In years 7 and 8 of Ibbi-Sin's kingship, the the price of grain increased to 60 times the normal rate. The connection between that price spike and the Amorite disruption of trade routes is well documented in the scholarship. What followed was a famine severe enough to drive large-scale population displacement, a weakening of the military infrastructure that had kept the empire coherent, and a gradual shrinking of the territory Ibn Sina could meaningfully govern. The Elamites came from the east. They sacked Ur. They took Ibn Sina into captivity. Before that fall, before the Elamites reached the walls, there must have been mornings inside the palace at Ur when the weight of what was coming was already present in every room. The grain accounts were wrong. The border reports were wrong. The letters from Ishbi-Erra had stopped carrying the right kind of reassurance. Ibn Sina was a king in a system built to make kings feel like vessels of something eternal. And what that system could not protect him from was the particular texture of watching the thing you were supposed to embody drain quietly out of your hands, while men with barges and grain prices and better positioning decided where it was going next. The city of Ur, whose third dynasty had been the last great expression of unified Sumerian political power, whose ziggurat stood as the most visible architecture of divine kingship in the ancient world, fell, the lament for Sumer and Ur, catalogued in the electronic text corpus as ECSL 2.2.3, was composed to describe this moment. It is one of a group of Sumerian city laments that use a distinctive literary mode. The city itself, or its tutelary deity, speaks in the voice of a mother or a woman abandoned, describing the destruction of everything she had built and loved. The translations that survive are devastating in their specificity. The Ki Ur, Enlil's resting place, has become a haunted shrine. The channels of the city are dammed. The orchards are scorched. The lament describes what happened to Urim, what the Elamites did to the granaries and the temples, and the people in terms that do not sentimentalize the violence, but record it, line by line, in the same meticulous cuneiform hand that had recorded grain prices and boat manifests and royal hymns. What is striking about the lament for Sumer and Ur, from the perspective of the Sumerian king list's mechanism, is what it does with the divine abandonment. The poem does not argue that the gods were absent or weak or indifferent. It argues that they actively decided to let this happen. Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag, the text says, decided the fate of Sumer. They decided to overturn its divine powers. They decided to lock up the favourable rain in its home. They decided to destroy the city. The gods chose the destruction of Ur. The gods carried the Nam Lugal away from it. The same verb, the same mechanism, the same structure that had transferred the kingship from Eridu to Bad Tibira to Larag to Zimbir to Kurupag before the flood. From Kitch to Uruk to Ur after it. The kingship was carried away from Ur the way it had always been carried. Not by human decision, not by military force alone, by the will that moves the Nam Lugal from one vessel to the next. And where was it carried? To Asin, to the city that Ishbi-Erra had been quietly fortifying while the grain prices rose and the Amorites blocked the rivers, and the last king of Ur wrote increasingly desperate administrative letters to a man who had already decided where his future lay. The Sumerian king list records the Essene dynasty as the legitimate continuation of the post-flood kingship. Ishbi-Erra appears in it not as a usurper or a traitor, but as a king who received the Nam Lugal in the proper way, who held it for the proper duration, and whose successors continued the line. The machinery of the document absorbed the transition that had been, in lived human terms, a combination of political betrayal, economic catastrophe, foreign invasion, and institutional collapse. And it rendered all of that into a single clean transfer. The kingship was taken to Essene. Barde carried, the Essene dynasty lasted from approximately 2017 to 1794 BCE. 14 kings. 223 years. It is the last dynasty recorded in some versions of the Sumerian king list, though other versions include further material. And the Weld Blundell prism itself represents a particular recension of the text compiled during the Larsa period, around 1800 BC, when Essene and Larsa were the two dominant city-states of southern Mesopotamia and had been competing for dominance for nearly 2 centuries. The prism was not being made to record history for its own sake. It was being made to make a claim. Whoever commissioned it was making the argument that the chain of divine, kingship the chain that runs from Alulim of Eridu through the flood to Kitch, through Uruk and Ur and Akkad and Gutum and Ur again and Essene, and now here, is continuous, unbroken, and currently culminating in whoever is holding power at the moment of the prism's creation. This is the argument made by the scholar Piotr Michalowski in his 1983 paper in the Journal of the American Oriental Society. Michalowski argued that the Sumerian king list functions as a charter narrative, a document whose primary purpose is not to record the past, but to authorize the present. The specific recension of the text preserved on any given tablet or prism was selected and shaped to serve the political needs of the ruler who commissioned its copying. The document was designed to absorb new history without appearing to change. The core mechanism, the divine origin, the pre-flood kings, the flood, the post-flood transfer sequence. The formula of Barde repeating through every dynasty those elements were stable across versions. They had to be stable, because their stability was the source of their authority. A document that claims to record the eternal and unchanging institution of divine kingship cannot be seen to change its fundamental claims without undermining itself. But the end of the list was flexible. The most recent dynasty could be extended, a new entry could be added, a new king could be inserted at the tail of the chain to indicate that the Nam Lugal had now been received by a specific ruler in a specific city. The eternal document absorbed new history by appending it to the bottom of an eternal framework. The top of the list was cosmic, the bottom of the list was current events, and the reader, the scribe, the king, the priest, who was trained to know this document, experienced both as the same thing. Picture the scribe who made the Weld Blundell prism. He is sitting in a tablet room in Larsa in 1800 BC. The clay in front of him is fresh, mixed that morning, still cool at the edges where the air has touched it. He has a stylus made from a cut reed, its end trimmed to a particular angle. The lamp to his left is a small bowl of oil with a wick of twisted flax. The room smells of both, wet clay and burning fat, the twin smells of everything this civilization has ever made. He has copied this text before. He has been copying since childhood. His hands know the shapes of the signs the way your hands know the keys of a familiar door in the dark. He is pressing names into the clay that he has pressed into clay 100 times before. Alulim, Alalyar, Enmenluana, and now at the bottom of the last column he is pressing names that are not ancient at all, names from within living memory. The kings of Isin, the kings of now. He does not experience any discontinuity between the two sections, because he has been trained not to, because the document itself is designed to close that gap before the reader can feel it. You believe this, the training says, not because you have been forced to, because you have spent your entire education with your hands in the evidence of it. The evidence is the text you are copying. The text is the evidence. The machine does not require faith, it requires literacy. And literacy in ancient Mesopotamia was controlled entirely by the institutions that produced scribes, the Aduba, the Scribal Academy, the same academy that Shulgi had built, the same academy whose preservation of his hymns he had ordered and whose copying practices he had institutionalized, the academy that taught the Sumerian king list as a foundational document was the same institution that produced the administrators who ran the empire, the priests who managed the temples, the diplomats who negotiated between cities, and the military officials who enforced the state's decisions. The machine had no single operator. It had a class of operators, trained from childhood, who replicated its logic in every document they produced. The political claims of the Sumerian king list were not maintained by a single ruler's decree. They were maintained by the ongoing practice of an educational system that produced people who understood reality in the terms the document provided. Every durable ideological system works this way, not through force, which is expensive and unreliable, but through education, which is cheap and produces people who enforce the system on themselves because they have internalized its logic. The genius of the Sumerian king list is that it accomplished this for 3,000 years. The document that Thorkild Jacobsen studied, that he compiled into his monumental 1939 work, Assyriological Studies No. 11, published by the Oriental Institute in Chicago, was the first comprehensive modern scholarly treatment of a document whose copying had begun perhaps 1,000 years before Jacobsen was born. The copying tradition that produced the Weld Blundell prism ended sometime around or after 1700 BC, when the Sumerian language itself ceased to be a living administrative language and became a scholarly and liturgical language preserved by specialists in the same way that Latin was preserved in medieval European monasteries, alive in the academy, dead in the street. The ideas the document contained did not die with the Sumerian language. There is a tablet in the British Museum whose story connects the Sumerian king list to a man who lived 2,000 years after Shulgi, and who was, in his own way, doing precisely what Shulgi had done. He was Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, who ruled from 668 to around 627 BCE. He built the great library at Nineveh, a collection of cuneiform tablets gathered from every corner of the known world: mythology, science, medicine, divination, history, poetry. He sent scribes and agents to temples and private collections across Mesopotamia to copy texts that were in danger of being lost. He understood, with a sophistication rare in any era, that the power of a king who controls the texts of civilization is of a different order than the power of a king who merely controls territory. Among the texts in the Library of Nineveh was the standard Babylonian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, assembled into its 12-tablet form by scholars working within the Assyrian scribal tradition. And among the tablets that had passed through Ashurbanipal's library was a copy of the Gilgamesh epic, made by a scribe whose name has survived on his own colophons. His name was Nabu Zukupkinu. He was active from approximately 766 to 684 BCE, working primarily at Kalhu, the Assyrian capital before Nineveh, during the reigns of Sargon II and Sennacherib. His personal tablet collection was later acquired by Ashurbanipal and moved to Nineveh, where scholars at the Oriental Institute and the State Archives of Assyria project have traced his careful hand across dozens of cuneiform tablets. Nabu-Zukub-Kinu was not just copying, he was curating. A copier reproduces, a curator selects, preserves, and implicitly endorses. His copy of Gilgamesh says, "In the physical fact of its existence, this text is worth preserving. This text is part of the legitimate intellectual and political tradition of the civilization I serve." Hold that man in mind for a moment. He is sitting in a scriptorium at Kalhu somewhere around 700 BCE. He is a professional at the height of his profession, which means his hands are steadier than most people's hands, and his knowledge of the signs is deeper than most people's knowledge of anything. He is pressing a stylus into clay and reproducing a story about a king who may or may not have been a real person, a king embedded in the Sumerian king list with a phantom father and a 126-year reign 2,000 years before Nabu-Zukub-Kenu was born. A king who had become the vehicle for the greatest meditation on mortality in the ancient world. And Nabu-Zukub-Kenu is adding his name to it, because scribes signed their work, because the act of copying was itself an act of cultural authority, an act of claiming participation in the chain that ran from Alu-Lim of Eridu to the library on the hill above the Tigris. The chain that had begun on a four-sided clay prism in Larsa around 1800 BC was now being extended in a different city, in a different empire, by a named individual who would not have described himself as serving the aims of the Sumerian king list, but who was, in the most functional sense, doing exactly that. The document had found new rooms, new scribes, new hands. Now consider the Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi was king of Babylon from approximately 1792 to 1750 BC, a contemporary of the last phase of the Asin-Larsa competition and the eventual conqueror who unified southern Mesopotamia under Babylonian rule. His law code is one of the most famous documents in the ancient world, inscribed on a black diorite stele that now stands in the Louvre in Paris. At the top of the stele, a carved relief shows Hammurabi standing before the sun god Shamash. The king is receiving something from the god, or presenting himself to the god, or both. The visual grammar is unmistakable to anyone who has spent time with Mesopotamian iconography. A king in the presence of his divine patron, receiving or confirming his mandate to govern. The prologue of the law code itself begins with Hammurabi's divine genealogy. He names himself as the pious prince who fears the gods, the favourite of Anu and Enlil, the one who brought prosperity to his people, the shepherd, the king of righteousness. He traces his authority through Anu and Enlil, through Marduk, the city god of Babylon, through an unbroken chain of divine election that connects his specific law code to the cosmic framework of divine governance. Hammurabi is not in the Sumerian king list in any surviving version. The list predates his dynasty in its canonical form, but his law code uses the same structural logic the list had spent centuries teaching, divine authority descending from heaven, channeled through a specific king, expressing itself in specific rules for human conduct. The prologue and epilogue of the law code are the most politically important parts of the document, not the laws themselves. The laws could change. What could not change was the claim that the authority behind them was eternal and divine. The machine had taught this lesson well enough that it no longer needed the original document to replicate its core logic. There is a question buried in the structure of the Sumerian king list that the document itself will not answer. It will not answer it because to answer it would be to break the mechanism. The question is, who decides when the Nam-Lugal moves? The text records the transfers. It tells you where the kingship was and where it went next. It tells you that it was carried, but it does not tell you who did the carrying, who made the decision, who said, on this day the kingship leaves this city and goes to that one. In the pre-flood section, the divine will is implied by the cosmological framework. The gods arranged it. The timing was celestial. But in the post-flood section, the transfers happen at the ends of dynasties that sometimes collapsed through military defeat, sometimes through famine, sometimes through internal political fragmentation, sometimes through all three at once. The mechanism is silent on the mechanics. This silence is the most important design feature of the document. If the text specified who made the decision that the Nam-Lugal moved, then that decision maker would be identifiable. They would be a person or a class of persons with institutional authority to determine the legitimacy of any given ruler. A person can be challenged. A class of persons can be investigated. Their decisions can be questioned. Their qualifications can be disputed. Their conflicts of interest can be pointed out. But a mechanism that works by itself, that produces transfers without specifying a human agent behind them, that records the fact of legitimacy without revealing the process by which legitimacy is assigned, that mechanism is immune to investigation. There is no one to summon and question. There is no committee whose minutes can be subpoenaed. There is no election official who could be pressured to change the result. There is only the text. And the text says the kingship was carried. Who carried it? The text does not say. Every political system that claims to derive its authority from a transcendent source, whether divine will, natural law, historical inevitability, or the arc of progress, replicates this structural feature. The authority is real. It is legitimate. It cannot be questioned. And the process by which it arrived in the hands of the current holder is not fully specified, because full specification would introduce the possibility of verification, and verification introduces the possibility of failure. The Sumerian king list was a cosmology, not a conspiracy. The distinction matters because conspiracies require conscious coordination, shared secrets, active deception. Cosmologies require only shared assumption. The scribes who copied the list were not lying. They were educating. The kings who commissioned the copies were not deceiving their subjects. They were articulating the world as they understood it. A world in which divine kingship was a real substance that moved through real cities and real people, and the documentation of its movement was the highest responsibility of the scribal profession. The effect, though, was the same either way, a self-sustaining structure of political authority whose legitimacy was unfalsifiable, whose mechanism was invisible, and whose perpetuation required only the ongoing practice of copying, teaching, and treating the document as foundational. The structure survived the Sumerians. It survived the Akkadians. It survived the Gutians and the Ur III dynasty, and the Isin-Lhasa period, and the Old Babylonian unification, and the Kassite dynasty, and the Middle Assyrian period, and the Neo-Assyrian Empire, whose kings, like Ashurbanipal, preserved the texts that preserved the framework. And then it encountered the question that the Weld Blundell prism, sitting in its glass case in Oxford, still does not answer. What happens when the copying stops? The Sumerian language ceased to be spoken as a native tongue sometime around 2000 BC, perhaps earlier. It survived as a literary and liturgical language, the way Latin survived in Europe, for another 2000 years. Scribes in the Old Babylonian period, the period of Hammurabi, were still learning Sumerian in the Aduba as part of their professional training. The language was not theirs the way a mother tongue is yours. It was a language of authority, of antiquity, of the divine, learned deliberately because the most important texts in the civilization were written in it and could not be understood without it. When Sumerian was taught, the Sumerian king list was among the texts taught. When scribes practiced copying, they copied the list among other foundational documents. When kings commissioned prestige inscriptions, they sometimes commissioned new recensions of the list to incorporate their own dynasties into its chain. The list was a living document in the specific sense that it was being actively used to do political and religious work in every generation that preserved it. But at some point, in the turmoil of the 2nd and 1st millennium BC, as the centres of Mesopotamian civilization shifted north and east, as Babylon rose and fell under the Kassites and the Chaldeans, as the Assyrian Empire expanded and collapsed, as the Persians arrived and absorbed Mesopotamia into a different imperial framework with a different religious architecture, the copying slowed and then, as far as the surviving record shows, stopped. The last known version of the Sumerian king list that scholars can date with confidence was compiled sometime around 1800 BC. The Well-Blundell prism is from that period. There are other fragments, other tablets, some from slightly later, but the great tradition of active political use of the document, the commissioning of new recensions to incorporate new dynasties into the divine chain. That tradition has no confirmed continuation beyond the Isin-Larsa period. When Hammurabi conquered Isin and Larsa and unified southern Mesopotamia under Babylon, he did not commission a new version of the Sumerian king list that included his dynasty. He could have. The scribes existed, the tradition existed, the template was available. He chose instead to articulate his authority through his own law code, his own divine prologue, his own relationship with Shamash and Marduk. The framework was the same. The specific document was not used. The instrument had found a new form. And in finding a new form, it had demonstrated the deepest truth about the mechanism it encoded. The Sumerian king list was never the mechanism itself. It was a particular historical expression of a mechanism that is older and more general than any specific document. The mechanism is the claim that legitimate authority derives from a source that transcends individual human beings and their biological genealogies, that the institution of governance is older and more real than any particular governor, that whoever currently holds power holds it not because of personal strength or inherited wealth or popular consent, but because a force that operates outside human verification has placed them in that position. This claim does not require cuneiform, it does not require clay, it does not require Sumerian, it requires only the will to make it and the institutional capacity to transmit it. There is a scholar's test you can perform on any document that claims to record divine or natural authority, and the Sumerian king list passes this test in a way that is either reassuring or troubling, depending on how you look at it. The test is who benefits from the document being believed, not who benefits from the historical events the document describes. Who benefits from the document itself being accepted as legitimate. as authoritative, as a true record of how power flows through the world. In its earliest phases, the answer is clear and relatively uncomplicated. The kings who commissioned the document and the scribal class who were employed to produce it both benefited. The kings received a cosmological justification for their authority that was impossible to falsify. The scribes received their professional position, their social status, their institutional home in the Aduba, and their identity as the custodians of civilization's most important knowledge. As the document was revised and extended across the centuries, the circle of beneficiaries expanded. Every dynasty that had its name inserted into the chain of the list gained the same cosmological legitimacy. Every scribal academy that taught the list perpetuated its own institutional importance. Every temple that accepted the theological framework of divine kingship reinforced the social contract that kept the temples funded and the priests employed. The document was a technology that served the interests of enough overlapping institutional actors to ensure its own perpetuation, not because those actors sat in a room and decided to perpetuate it, because perpetuating it was simply what each of them did as a natural consequence of occupying their role in the structure. This is the actual bloodline the document traces, not the biological lineage of a single family across 5,000 years, not the secret genetic heritage of a ruling class that has managed to disguise its continuity through every regime change in recorded history. Those interpretations, popular as they are in certain kinds of documentary filmmaking and internet speculation, miss the more interesting and more defensible point. The bloodline is the mechanism. The bloodline is the framework. The bloodline is the set of structural assumptions about the relationship between divine authority and human governance that was encoded in the Sumerian king list, transmitted through the scribal tradition, and then, when the Sumerian scribal tradition ended, transmitted through every other institutional form that made the same fundamental claim in a different language, using a different cosmology with a different cast of divine characters. The pre-flood kings do not need to be real people for this to be true. The 28,800-year reign of Alulim does not need to be a literal historical fact. What needs to be operational is the logic, that there is a legitimate authority that comes from outside the human world, that it is carried from one holder to the next by a force that operates outside human verification, that the documentation of this carrying constitutes the highest form of political and cultural legitimacy, and that the institutions that produce and preserve this documentation are themselves authoritative precisely because they handle something that cannot be directly examined. The prism in the Ashmolean glass case, accession number AN 923-444, about 20 centimetres tall, four-sided, inscribed with 8 columns of cuneiform that begin after the kingship descended from heaven, is not a record of alien beings who ruled the earth before the flood, nor is it a coded message from a secret society that has been running global affairs since the Bronze Age. It is something simultaneously more mundane and more extraordinary than either of those readings. It is a working machine that was built to produce unfalsifiable authority, and it worked for 3,000 years. And the most sophisticated version of the logic it encodes is still working now, in institutions whose names and cosmologies and languages are entirely different from anything a scribe in Lhasa would recognize, but whose structural claim is the same. The kingship descended from heaven, it was carried here, and it is here now. Before the light comes back, there is one more thread to follow. The woman who ran a tavern in Kish around 2400 BC, who made firm the foundations of that city and held the kingship for 100 years, whose name in the Sumerian king list is Kugbao, she is not the end of the story the way the Prism's text implies. The scholars who have traced the linguistic and iconographic lineage from Kugbao of Kish to the goddess Kubaba of Carchemish to Cybele of Phrygia, and finally to Magna Mater, the great mother of Rome, are careful about their claims. The connection is argued from name similarity, iconographic overlap, geographical continuity, and the evidence of how divine figures travel across cultures. It is not proven in the way a mathematical theorem is proven. It is argued carefully from the available evidence. But consider what the argument implies, if it holds. A woman who served beer in a Sumerian city, who somehow received or seized or was given the name Lugal, who ruled for a century and founded a dynasty, who was remembered in the most foundational political document of the ancient world as the only woman ever to hold the kingship, she did not disappear when the Sumerian language stopped being spoken. Her name was carried into a new cosmology, a new culture, a new religious tradition, and she became a goddess. Not just any goddess, the goddess of the mountain, the goddess of the wild, the goddess whose worship involved the most ecstatic and irreversible devotions, the goddess whose priests cut themselves during her festivals to demonstrate that they had moved beyond the ordinary human relationship to pain and the body, the goddess whose annual festival in Rome, the Megalesia, was one of the great public events of the Roman calendar, with theatrical performances and processions and the kind of crowd that fills a city's streets. This transformation is not evidence of a bloodline in the genetic sense. It is evidence of something more durable, a name and an energy attached to a specific figure in a specific document that proved resilient enough to survive the death of the civilization that created it and find purchase in every successive civilization that occupied the same geographical and cultural space. The mechanism carried her the way it carried the kingship, Bardeh, taken from Kish to Carchemish to Sardis to Rome, from tavern keeper to mountain goddess, from political figure to religious one, from the pages of a bureaucratic king list to the Palatine Hill. She arrived in Rome in 204 BCE during the Second Punic War, brought at the express command of the Roman Senate, who had consulted the Sibylline books and been told that she was necessary for Rome's survival against Hannibal. She came from Pessinus in Phrygia in the form of a black stone, a meteorite or something similar, and she was placed in the Temple of Victory on the Palatine Hill while her permanent temple was being built. Scipio Africanus himself, according to Livy, met the ship that carried her into the Tiber and escorted her into the city. The Roman Senate, one of the most sophisticated political bodies in the ancient world, had just invited a goddess whose most distant traceable origin was a woman who sold beer in a Sumerian city 1,000 years before Rome existed, to take up official residence in their capital. She arrived. She was welcomed. The next year, the Romans won the war. The machine was running in a new room with new operators and new cosmological furniture, and it was doing exactly what it had always done. You are somewhere between waking and sleeping, and in that space. The distance between Eridu in 3200 BC and wherever you are tonight has been closing for the last 2.5 hours. Not because the list requires you to believe in divine kings or celestial reigns or a substance called Nam-Lugal that descends from heaven and travels from city to city in a verb. You do not need to believe any of that. The scribes who copied the Weld Blundell prism may not have believed it in the way we mean when we say someone believes something. They pressed those words into clay because that was their job, their training, their professional identity, and because the words carried weight in the institutions they served. What the list asks of you, if it asks anything, is only this: recognition. Recognition that the structure it describes is real, not in the theological sense, but in the operational sense. That every political system you have ever encountered makes some version of the claim that its authority derives from a source that transcends individual human beings. That the institution is older and more legitimate than any particular person who holds power within it. That the chain reaches back far enough that its origins are effectively beyond investigation. That the mechanism of legitimacy is not fully visible to those who live within it, because the mechanism's invisibility is part of what makes it function. This does not make all political systems equivalent or all claims to authority equally valid. The law code Hammurabi inscribed on his diorite stele contained actual rules about actual conduct with actual consequences for actual people. The rules were better or worse depending on what they required. The divine framework in the prologue did not make the laws just, but it made them durable. The Sumerian king list is a description, not a warning. It describes how authority works in a world where no single individual can survive long enough to personally verify the chain of legitimacy they inherit. Every civilization that has tried to build durable political institutions has encountered this problem and produced some version of the same answer: a founding myth, a sacred text, a constitutional document, a legal tradition, a religious cosmology, something that reaches back far enough to precede living memory and establishes a framework that the present authority claims to stand within rather than to have invented. The pre-flood kings are the reaching back. The post-flood kings are the living tradition. The mechanism that connects them is the transfer formula. The transfer formula is the gram of logic that every subsequent version of this answer has in some form borrowed. The clay has survived 4,000 years. The text pressed into it by a scribe in Lhasa, copying from an older text, has been read by a small number of specialists and a much larger number of people who have heard it described without reading it themselves. The prism sits in its glass case and is visited by tourists who photograph it with their phones and move on to the next case. What the prism contains is not a secret. Secrets require active concealment. The Sumerian king list has been available for scholarly examination since the 19th century and publicly accessible in translation for decades. The ECCSL translations at Oxford are free to anyone with an internet connection. The mechanism is not hidden, it is structural. Structures do not hide, they do not need to. They are simply what holds everything else up, present everywhere and noticed nowhere, the way you do not notice the weight of the atmosphere until something reminds you that you are living at the bottom of it. After Isin fell, and after the Weld Blundell prism was made, and after the active political use of the Sumerian king list as a document for authorizing current rulers gradually ceased, the physical prisms and tablets that carried the text continued to exist in the ground under the cities of Mesopotamia. They waited there in the dark. Under thousands of years of accumulated soil and human habitation and war and weather, until the 19th and 20th centuries brought archaeologists with trowels and measuring tapes and the patience to sift through the debris of 4,000 years. The Weld Blundell prism was dug up or traded for around 1921 or 1922 near the site of ancient Kish. Herbert Weld Blundell brought it to England. It was catalogued as AN 1923.444. It went into a glass case. Thorkild Jacobson studied it, along with every other version of the Sumerian king list he could locate, and in 1939 published his comprehensive analysis as the 11th volume in the Oriental Institute's Assyriological Studies series. He identified the manuscript families, the variant readings, the political contexts of different recensions, the relationship between the list and contemporaneous royal inscriptions. He did not argue that the pre-flood kings were real. He did not argue that the mechanism was a conspiracy. He argued, carefully and with extraordinary erudition, that the document was one of the most sophisticated works of political literature produced in the ancient world. Peter Michalowski, writing in 1983 in the Journal of the American Oriental Society, sharpened Jacobson's argument into the charter thesis. The list was a successful example of a distinct genre, the genre of documents designed to make authority feel eternal and inevitable, rather than a failed attempt at historiography evaluated against standards of modern accuracy that it was never built to meet. Andrew George, whose critical edition of the Babylonian Gilgamesh epic, published in 2003, remains the standard scholarly reference, places the epic in its relationship to the king list by noting that the figure of Gilgamesh moves between the two traditions, historical and literary, in a way that illuminates how Mesopotamian culture understood the boundary between the two. Gilgamesh in the list is a king with a phantom father and a 126-year reign. Gilgamesh in the epic is a man who goes to the ends of the earth and discovers that the gods, when they created human beings, gave death to humanity and kept life for themselves. The two Gilgameshes are the same figure expressed in two different registers, one for the institution of kingship, one for the individual who holds it and ultimately loses it. The tablets that carry the epic were being copied in Kalhu and Nineveh during Nabu-Zukup-Kinu's active years, 766 to 684 BCE, when his careful hand added his name to the tradition, and Ashurbanipal's collectors later moved his tablets north to the Great Library above the Tigris. The tablets that carry the king list were being copied in Lhasa around 1800 BCE, when the scribe who made the Weld Blundell prism added the Isin dynasty to the bottom of the chain. Both copyists were doing the same work in the same tradition, with the same assumptions about what it meant to copy a text, to participate in the chain, to extend it, to be, for that moment, one of the hands through which the mechanism passed. The mechanism does not require special people. It requires people who do the work of preservation, who are trained to believe that preservation matters, who are embedded in institutions that reward that belief and that would suffer if the belief ceased. Every library that exists in the world tonight, every university that teaches history, every museum that stores old things in climate-controlled rooms, every publishing house that prints books about the ancient world, every algorithm that recommends a video about the Sumerian king list to someone lying in the dark with their phone. All of those are, in the most structural and non-conspiratorial sense, performing the function that the Scribal Academy performed in ancient Ur and ancient Lhasa. They are preserving the texts. They are transmitting the frameworks. They are ensuring that the mechanism has new rooms, new hands, new voices to pass through. The kingship does not descend from heaven into any of those institutions. The specific cosmological claim of the Sumerian document does not travel with its logic into these contemporary forms. The logic travels, the claim stays in the clay. But the logic is enough. The logic is what the prism was built to carry. The last line of the Sumerian king list in the version on the Weld Blundell prism tallies the results: 134 kings, 28,876 years, plus some months and days that differ between manuscript traditions, 11 cities through which the kingship passed, from before the flood to the end of the Essene dynasty, from Alulim of Eridu, who ruled for 28,800 years with no father and no origin, to the last king of Essene, who ruled for a span of years that differs between the manuscript variants but is measured in the ordinary human.